Helen Mackey stood at the county recorder's office in Silverton, Colorado, and counted out $2 in coins she had saved by not eating dinner for a week. The clerk looked at the money, then looked at her, then looked at the deed she was purchasing with an expression that suggested he was watching someone make a terrible mistake. "Ma'am," he said, "you understand this claim is worthless. The shaft collapsed 8 months ago. There's no silver left, and even if there was, you'd need $10,000 in timber and labor just to make it safe to work." "I understand. The only reason Mr. Pratt is selling it at all is because he's tired of paying taxes on dead ground. $2 barely covers the filing fee. I understand." The clerk shrugged and stamped the deed. It wasn't his job to save foolish widows from themselves. Helen took the paper and walked out into the September sunshine, holding the deed to the mine that had killed her husband, the worthless hole in the mountain that was now the only thing she owned in the world. Patrick Mackey had died on January 15th, 1887, when a support timber cracked and brought down the ceiling of the drift he was working. They found his body 3 days later, crushed beneath rock that had been there since the mountains were young. He was 26 years old. They had been married for 2 years. They had been saving money to buy a house in town, to start a family, to build the kind of life that people came west to find. The mining company had paid for the funeral. That was the extent of their generosity. Patrick's wages for the month he had worked before dying were applied to company debts he had allegedly accumulated, and Helen received nothing. The boarding house where they had been living gave her a week to find somewhere else to stay. The church offered prayers, but not lodging. The other miners' wives, many of them widows themselves, had nothing to spare. She had spent the summer working as a laundress, washing clothes for the men who were still alive, saving every cent she didn't absolutely need to spend on food. She had watched the other widows leave town one by one, heading back to families in the East, or moving to Denver, or simply disappearing into the kind of desperate circumstances that no one talked about in polite company. She had refused to leave. The mine had taken Patrick. The mine would give something back. She found Tomas Esperanza at the cantina on the edge of town, nursing a beer he couldn't really afford with money he had earned doing odd jobs since the silver played out. He was 63 years old and had been mining since he was 12, first in Mexico, then in California, then here in Colorado when the silver boom brought everyone who could swing a pick. He had survived cave-ins, explosions, and the slow death of watching industry move on and leave him behind. He looked up when Helen sat down across from him, his weathered face showing no surprise. He had been expecting her, or someone like her, ever since he heard she was still in town. "You bought the Mackey shaft," he said. It wasn't a question. "I did. It's worthless. The collapse filled the main drift. You'd need months of digging just to clear the rubble, and there's nothing behind it but played-out rock. I know there's no silver left. That's not why I bought it." Tomas was quiet for a moment, something shifting in his eyes. "Then why?" Helen had been thinking about the answer to that question for months. She had been thinking about it since the day she went to the mine entrance to see where Patrick had died, standing at the mouth of the shaft and feeling the air that came up from below. Cool air, constant air, air that didn't change temperature, whether the surface was baking under summer sun or freezing under winter snow. "The shaft goes down 60 feet before it branches," she said. "The temperature down there stays the same all year. I felt it when I visited in July, and I felt it again last week. 55 degrees. Summer or winter, day or night, 55 degrees. Tomas stared at her. You want to live in the mine. I want to survive the winter. I have no money for fuel. I have no money for rent. I have no money for food unless I keep working, and I can't work if I'm dead from cold. But if I can live somewhere that stays 55 degrees without a fire, I don't need fuel. I don't need a house. I just need walls and a roof and a door. The shaft is dangerous. The collapse was in the main drift, 60 feet down and 100 feet in. The entrance chamber is solid. You told Patrick that yourself, back when you were training him. The first 40 feet of that shaft have been stable since they dug it in 1879. Tomas said nothing for a long moment. He was remembering conversations he had with Patrick Mackey, the young Irishman who had come to Colorado with stars in his eyes and a willingness to work that the old miner had respected. He was remembering pulling Patrick's body from the rubble, carrying it to the surface, watching Helen's face when she saw what was left of her husband. I will help you, he said finally, not because it is safe, but because you are right, and because I owed Patrick a debt I could not repay while he lived. Stay with me, because the way she turned that mine shaft into a home is the reason she was still alive when spring came and the town had lost a dozen people to the cold. The entrance chamber of the Mackey shaft was a natural widening in the rock, a space roughly 15 feet wide and 20 feet deep, carved by the original miners as a staging area before the real digging began. The walls were solid granite, stable and dry, unmarked by the cracks and seepage that signaled dangerous ground. The floor was hard-packed earth, covered with a layer of old timber and debris that would need to be cleared. The temperature inside was exactly what Helen had remembered, 55 degrees, constant and unchanging, maintained by the thermal mass of the mountain itself. At that depth, below the frost line, the rock held the average annual temperature of the region, regardless of what happened on the surface. It wasn't warm, but it wasn't freezing. With proper insulation and a small heat source, it could be made comfortable. Helen and Tomas spent September preparing the space. They cleared the debris, swept the floor, reinforced the entrance with new timbers they salvaged from abandoned structures around town. They built a wooden frame inside the chamber, creating walls that could hold insulation, dividing the space into a sleeping area and a living area. They hung a heavy canvas tarp across the entrance and built a simple wooden door behind it, creating an airlock that would keep the warm air in and the cold air out. The insulation was straw, purchased cheaply from a rancher who was culling his herd before winter and had more bedding than animals to use it. They packed it between the wooden walls of the interior structure, 6 inches thick on all sides, creating a cocoon of dead air that would hold whatever heat was generated inside. The straw was dry and clean, and it smelled like summer, even as the first snow began to fall on the peaks above. Mr. Pratt came to see the work in early October, riding out on his horse with his mutton chop whiskers and his gold watch chain, curious about what the widow was doing with the worthless claim he had sold her. He found Helen hauling a load of straw into the mine entrance and Tomas building shelves against the interior wall. "Mrs. Mackey," Pratt said, not dismounting, "I heard you were doing some kind of construction out here. I assumed it was a joke." "It's not a joke, Mr. Pratt. It's my home." He looked at the mine entrance, at the canvas tarp, at the wooden door visible behind it. His expression was the particular mix of pity and contempt that Helen had learned to recognize over the past 8 months. "You're going to live in a hole in the ground, like an animal. Like a person who can't afford the rent you charge for your company houses, Mr. Pratt. Like a widow whose husband's wages were stolen to pay debts he never owed. Pratt's face tightened. Those debts were legitimate. Company store credit, equipment fees, lodging. Patrick paid cash for everything. He kept records. I have them. Helen set down her load of straw and faced him directly. But it doesn't matter now. You sold me this claim for $2, and what I do with it is my business, unless you'd like to buy it back. She watched him calculate. The claim was worthless for mining, but if she had found some way to make it livable, it might be worth something after all. She could see the greed flickering behind his eyes, the instinct to take back what he had given away too cheaply. $10, he said. I'll give you $10 for the claim, and you can use the money to buy a train ticket somewhere civilized. The claim is not for sale, Mr. Pratt. Good afternoon. He rode away without another word, and Helen went back to hauling straw. She had neither the time nor the energy for men who thought poverty was a moral failing. She had a home to build before the snow got deep. The heating system was Thomas's contribution. He had learned it from an old-timer in California, a method for warming enclosed spaces with minimal fuel. They built a small brick firebox at the far end of the entrance chamber, vented through a pipe that ran along the floor before exiting through a hole they drilled in the ceiling. The pipe was made of scrap metal, salvaged from abandoned equipment around the mining district, and it radiated heat along its entire length as the smoke passed through. The principle was simple. Instead of letting the heat escape straight up through a chimney, they captured it and made it travel through the living space before leaving. By the time the smoke reached the exit, it had given up most of its warmth to the room. A fire that would heat a normal space for 1 hour could heat Helen's underground home for 3. She tested the system in November when the first real cold came down from the mountains. The temperature outside dropped to 15 below zero. The temperature inside the mine entrance stayed at 52 degrees without any fire at all, the rock still holding the warmth it had accumulated during the warmer months. When she lit a small fire in the brick firebox, the temperature rose to 62 degrees and stayed there for 6 hours after the fire went out. She did the math. A normal cabin at this elevation would need 8 to 10 hours of fire per day to stay livable in deep winter. Her underground home needed 3 to 4 hours. She would burn 1/3 the fuel, 1/3 the labor, 1/3 the risk of running out before spring. The winter of 1887 to 1888 was brutal. The old-timers said it was the worst they had seen since '79, and the ones who had been here in '79 said it was worse than that. Snow piled up 6 feet deep in town, and the drifts on the north-facing slopes were twice that. The temperature dropped to 35 below in January and stayed below zero for 3 weeks straight. People died. The boarding house lost 4 residents to cold-related illness, their rooms inadequate, their stoves insufficient, their bodies unable to maintain heat against the relentless draw of the frozen air. A family on the edge of town burned their cabin down, trying to keep a fire going all night, and 2 of the children didn't make it out. An old prospector was found frozen in his shack 3 weeks after anyone had seen him last. His woodpile exhausted, his body curled around a cold stove. Helen Mackey sat in her mine shaft and read books by candlelight, wrapped in blankets that she didn't strictly need, listening to the wind howl at the entrance without ever feeling its bite. The temperature in her underground home never dropped below 50 degrees. She burned less than half a cord of wood the entire winter, small fires that she lit in the morning and let die by noon, the brick firebox and metal pipe holding the heat long after the flames were gone. She had visitors, once word spread about the widow living in the mine. Most came out of curiosity, wanting to see the hole in the ground that was supposedly better than a house. They found Helen comfortable and warm, her small space neat and organized, her shelves stocked with preserved food she had put up in the fall. They found a home, not a cave. Tomas came once a week to check on her and to share a meal. He told her stories about the mines he had worked, the places he had been, the people he had known and lost. He taught her how to read the mountain, how to know when the snow was stable and when it was ready to slide. He taught her how to survive not just the winter, but the isolation, the quiet, the long dark hours when the only company was the mountain itself. In February, Mr. Pratt sent a man to offer $50 for the claim. Helen sent him back with a message. The claim was not for sale at any price. In March, as the snow began to melt and the roads became passable again, people started counting. 12 people had died in Silverton that winter, not counting the ones who had left before the worst of it and died somewhere else. The company had lost 2 buildings to fire and 1 to roof collapse. The boarding house was closing because there weren't enough residents left to keep it running. The widow in the mine shaft had survived without losing a day of work. She had continued doing laundry through the worst of the cold, carrying bundles through the snow, washing and drying them in her warm underground home, returning them clean and pressed, while other laundresses froze their hands too stiff to work. Mr. Pratt came himself in April when the wildflowers were starting to push through the mud and the mine roads were passable again. He found Helen planting a small garden near the entrance to her shaft, seeds she had saved from last year's work, vegetables that would supplement her diet through the coming summer. "Mrs. Mackey," he said, "I'd like to discuss your claim." Helen didn't look up from her planting. "The claim is not for sale." "I'm not here to buy it. I'm here to—" He paused, the words seeming to stick in his throat. "To ask your advice." Now she looked up. Pratt's face was different than it had been in October, the arrogance replaced by something that looked almost like humility. Almost. "The company is building new housing for the workers," he said. "More workers, I mean. We're opening a new drift on the Henderson claim, and we need places for the men to live. But after this winter, after what happened, I need to build something that won't kill people when the cold comes. You want me to tell you how to insulate a building. I want you to tell me how you survived when my buildings failed." Helen stood up, brushing the dirt from her hands. She thought about the men who had died in Pratt's boarding houses, the families who had lost children, the prospector frozen in his shack. She thought about Patrick, buried under a mountain because Pratt's company hadn't maintained the timbers properly. She thought about the wages that had been stolen, the debts that had been invented, the way Pratt had looked at her when he called her home a hole in the ground. She thought about all of it, and then she told him anyway. "Thermal mass," she said. "The earth holds heat when the air loses it. If you build your houses partly underground, or bank them with earth, or wrap them with any material that traps dead air, they'll hold their warmth longer. The mine stays 55 degrees because the rock around it never gets cold. You can't build a mine shaft for every worker, but you can build smart. Thick walls, double windows, earth banking on the north side. Small, efficient stoves with long flue pipes that radiate heat before the smoke leaves. It's not complicated. It's just physics." Pratt listened. He took notes. He asked questions that showed he was actually paying attention, not just going through the motions. When he was finished, he put away his notebook and looked at her with something that might have been respect. "What do I owe you for the consultation?" Helen thought about it. She could ask for money. She could ask for a lot of money, and Pratt would probably pay it because he needed what she knew, and there was no one else to ask. But money wasn't what she wanted. Money wasn't what Patrick would have wanted. "Build them properly," she said. "The new houses. Build them so that when winter comes, nobody dies because you were too cheap to do it right. That's what you owe me." The new company housing went up that summer, built to Helen's specifications, banked with earth on 3 sides, insulated with sawdust and straw, heated with efficient stoves that her design had improved. The workers who lived in them that winter reported that they used half the fuel of the old boarding houses and were twice as warm. Nobody died of cold in the company housing that year, or the year after, or the year after that. Helen lived in her mine shaft for 7 more years. She expanded it gradually, adding a second room by extending into a stable section of the tunnel, building proper furniture, installing a real floor. She got a dog, then a cat, then a small flock of chickens that lived in a coop she built near the entrance. She became a fixture in the community, the widow in the mine, the woman who had figured out how to survive when everyone expected her to die. She married again in 1894, a carpenter named William Reeves, who had come to Silverton to build the new company housing and stayed because he found something worth staying for. They built a house together, a proper house on the surface, but they built it using everything Helen had learned in the mine: thick walls, earth banking, efficient heating, a home that stayed warm without burning through a fortune in fuel. The mine shaft is still there, collapsed now but marked with a plaque that the Historical Society put up in 1962. The plaque says it was a silver mine that operated from 1879 to 1887. It doesn't mention that a widow lived there for 7 years afterward, that she survived winters that killed grown men, that she taught a mining company how to stop its workers from freezing to death. But the old-timers remember. They tell the story of the woman who bought a worthless hole in the ground for $2 and turned it into the warmest home in the county. They tell it to their children, and their children tell it to theirs, and the story survives even when the names are forgotten. Helen Mackey Reeves died in 1931 at the age of 68 in the house she and William had built on the site of her original claim. She was buried next to Patrick in the cemetery above town, her grave looking down at the valley she had refused to leave. The headstone gives her dates and her names, both of them, and beneath the names is a single line that William chose. She found warmth in cold places. Some stories end with the protagonist defeating their enemies. This one ends with something quieter, a woman who turned her tragedy into knowledge, who shared that knowledge even with the man who had wronged her, who survived not through vengeance, but through the simple refusal to die. If this story of underground warmth resonated with you, consider subscribing for more narratives of forgotten ingenuity. What is the abandoned mine in your own life that everyone else considers worthless? And what would happen if you looked past the collapse and saw the constant 55 degrees waiting in the dark?